Now, whenever you have decisions, you have good decisions and bad decisions. So, in a way, in principle, all systems are fallible. That is why I think we need to bear in mind in other contextual factors in order to think of what is the best form of governance for a particular society at a particular time. But what Humboldt, I think, is a bit optimistic with, and maybe it comes with Hoppe, and maybe it's an argument against this position, is that Humboldt seems to me to be incredibly optimistic about human nature, in a sense, because he thinks that the more freedom you give to people, the more benevolent they're going to be. He does seem to think of this as a generalization. Now, I think, roughly speaking, as a rough rule of thumb, this could be true, but it is sufficiently false to create problems for legislation. I think Machiavelli in Discourses on Livy is correct when he says that it is essential for the legislator to assume, for the purposes of legislating, that human beings are bad. Not because you want them to be bad or you think that they're bad, but because there are some rotten apples that they're sufficient, they are enough to cause problems. And I think that what Humboldt says, and tell me if it is also spilling over into Hoppe's thinking, Humboldt says that politics is the means for self-realization. It's not the goal. If we have republics, people will need to give so much time devote so much time into political participation that they're not going to have time to devote to their self-development. Now, there are two things I take issue with this. First of all, why do you think that part of your rich tapestry of variety of experiences and activities does not involve activities that are related to political participation? And second, why do you think that there aren't any incentives for those in power, in this case a monarch, to abuse power? And why am I asking this? Because if the people want to say, I'll just withdraw into my private sphere because I'll focus just on self-development and I'll let politics take care of itself, this causes incentives that you mentioned for anyone in power to take advantage of gaps of public awareness. And for all sorts of reasons, sometimes political expediency, to take advantage of the public lack of awareness and engage in practices that slowly and steadily will erode that freedom. And essentially, I want to say that this is, I think, a problem with classical liberalism, that there is so much focus on the pursuit of the self at the expense of also bearing in mind and checking power, and bearing in mind that any kind of self-development that we have in such terms, in societies that recognize a private sphere of activities that are free from interference, which are not the norm. I don't think it's the norm in human history. We need to be aware of how fragile that is. And I think that this is one of the main issues with classical liberalism, that it gives tremendous incentives for people to just say, okay, I'll be an economic actor and I'll let politics take care of itself because I don't have the time. And sometimes it's fair because people don't have the time to... A lot of people don't have less time, let's say, to devote. And I think, let me just say this, a lot of the practices that we criticize in the podcast and have criticized in the past, they are stuff that we are trying to communicate to people who aren't paying attention to news so much. And we have mentioned some horrible practices, especially when they involve children, for instance. They're horrible practices that we're trying to raise awareness and tell people, listen, there's a problem here. And I think a lot of the tendency of people to not listen to that message has to do with, for instance, not wanting to think, but also not having sufficient time to think. Because it's one thing to talk about, okay, the normie that thinks constantly of whatever the agenda says, and quite another to think of people in their workplaces where they have, DEI officers ready to decapitate them career-wise. All these are incentives and problems for people. They're taking a lot of time, and they prevent talking about things that the public should know. And we are trying to inform the public about.
All right, so I can respond to that. You have also brought up quite a number of points, so let me see if I can try and address them. So,
by the way, I love our discussion today.
Thank you. I'm enjoying it.
I hope you do as well.
Yeah. So first of all, when you discuss the idea of a thread in liberalism and libertarianism that is too positive in its view of human nature, I do think that is
too optimistic.
Optimistic, yeah. That is definitely a thread. One of the things about libertarianism, not necessarily Hoppian, because Hopper in his social views is very reactionary and very right-wing and does not take a positive view. So for instance, in his idea of the self-governing communities, he believes that there will be negative actors who are trying to operate within those communities, who will try and subvert it, who will try and promote values that are antithetical to the social bonds of that community, and that what we need to do with those people is physically remove them from those communities. He doesn't specify how exactly. It possibly conjures the idea of just, you pick them up by the briefs and you throw them over the border, or perhaps if they've broken laws in doing so, you could make an argument for the gallows. So he doesn't specify which one, but he does recognize that. But within more mainstream ideas of libertarianism, and this I'm thinking more of the Chicago school, perhaps the Milton Friedman strain of libertarianism, there is this idea that if you simply leave people up to their own economic activities, particularly those where the incentives are brought in by increasing profit for shareholders, that automatically that this will create some great incentive for only positive things to happen, and the economic actors in pursuit of profit only have positive things to add and don't act as political actors in themselves. Because one of the things that we've definitely seen is that economic action can easily slip over into political action. Even one of the great examples that people like to bring up when it comes to antitrust regulation and the necessity for it or the non-necessity for it, John D. Rockefeller was purely an economic actor. And then come the early 20th century, he ends up helping to establish the central bank. Because it turns out that as a purely economic actor, if you're having to deal with a lot of competition, then that's really difficult to keep your business going. That's really difficult to keep your business profitable when other people might pop up and make it more difficult for you because you're having to compete with them. And so it's actually very, very beneficial as an economic actor to get in with the government so they can establish regulations, they can establish new whole branches of the government so that they're able to work in your benefit. It's very easy to pay off politicians if you're a rich person. The other thing would be that on your discussion of the incentives of the king, I think Hopper's and others' responses to that would be, because you put forward the argument that if the citizens shy away from the political sphere, then that gives the king a lot of opportunity to be able to take advantage.
Anyone, not just a king. I'm not saying that there's something specific about being a king.
I think for them, they would say, yes, that is absolutely a problem. In absolutist France, I was recently reading through some descriptions from Englishmen who in the 17th century went over to France and wrote back to the king and wrote back to politicians talking about how grateful they should all be to be English, because he was talking about the great liberties of the English compared with the French, talking about how once or twice a year the peasants in these villages would essentially be raided for all that they had from the central government. So there are definitely incentives to take advantage of your own citizenship. I think the argument would be that with social democratic governments that we have right now, the incentive is far greater because of how limited a time they have and because they see themselves only as temporary administrators rather than full private owners of their sphere of influence. And so the idea is you get in, you steal from the public coffers as much as possible, and you leg it before anybody can put you in prison.
Okay.
I think in everything that I've said there, I've responded to most of the arguments that you presented and most of the discussion. And once again, I think it's enough to say that, yes, within the political thinkers that I'm discussing and you're discussing, I think there is room to recognize that no system is perfect.
Yeah,
and
no, we should definitely.
And these people that we're discussing, none of them were purely utopian thinkers, like some who are idolized today.
Yeah, and I do think that he is a bit optimistic, perhaps too optimistic, and there is a point in trying to bear in mind that, you know, things could go south. That is why I really like a lot of the insights of the classical Republican tradition that tries to create a system of checks and balances of power, and it frequently talks about the separation of powers. Why? Because I think Lord Acton had something, is more correct than Humboldt here, where he says that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think that's more correct than what Humboldt is saying, that the more freedom you give to people, the more benevolent they're going to be, as a general statement.
Yeah, and I think that's why I brought up, because I remember the 3 points that I have answered the 3 points that I wanted to discuss, but to make it more explicit, one of the other ones that you were talking about was this idea of withdrawing, becoming a purely economic actor. It's a complete fallacy, it's complete wrong-headed to think that by just becoming a purely economic actor that you are free of the bonds of political action, and in all likelihood, as I mentioned, the richer you get, if you do become an economic actor, and it turns out you're really good at it, and you make lots and lots of money, you become more likely to be able to effectively influence politics.
And I think we should end this section of the discussion by saying that there is an apolitical strand within classical liberalism, and its advocates should remember Pericles' saying that you may not want to care about politics, but politics will eventually care about you.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.